Welcome to Coastal Front, the show where we explore the insights of remarkable leaders. I'm especially thrilled to introduce Dr. Melissa Karmen Lee, the dynamic CEO of the Chinese Canadian Museum right here in Vancouver. Born in Vancouver, Melissa combines academic rigor and artistic flair with degrees from institutions like McGill and Lancaster. She's been a senior lecturer at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and a scholar in residence at Simon Fraser University. Before her current role, she was the Director of Education at the Vancouver Art Gallery. Internationally, she's helped launch Hong Kong's Tai Kwun Centre for Heritage and Art, orchestrating 200 programs in its first year. Today, as the inaugural CEO of the Chinese Canadian Museum, she's on a mission. Melissa's steering the museum towards fulfilling its vital mandate to honor and celebrate Chinese Canadian history, contributions, and living heritage here in British Columbia. Today, we'll discuss the museum, past policies affecting Chinese Canadians, and community safety. Melissa, it's a privilege to have you on Coastal Front today.
Thank you for having me over, Andrew. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great. Well, look, we're going to talk about some of the past discriminatory policies in a moment, but I first want to have the folks who may have not heard about your museum, because it just opened 2 months ago, to hear about it, because it's had actually quite a bit of media coverage, but it did just open 2 months ago. So first of all, for the listeners and viewers who are tuning in, can you tell us a little bit about what the Chinese Canadian Museum is?
So a little bit about those that have not heard about it or been to our museum. We're the first Chinese Canadian museum in Canada. We reside in the oldest building in Chinatown. It's a completely renovated contemporary building, but it was renovated to look contemporary, but it's originally heritage. And we opened 2 months ago on July 1st. Which was the 100-year anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And we show a multiple of different exhibitions. We have different programming, and we're just happy to be here in this historic year.
And I believe the building, if I recall, was donated by Bob Rennie. Is that correct?
So the building was not donated by Bob Rennie, but Bob Rennie is one of our major donors, the Rennie family. So most of the renovation of that building was the vision of Bob Rennie, who moved in the early 2000s, and it was partially his offices where he had his staff, and then partially it was also a place for him to show his private art collection. And he resided there for many decades, and then last year, we approached him and asked if he would be open to selling to us so that we could have the first Chinese Canadian museum in that building. And through some discussion and negotiation, he agreed to sell to us. But his family also donated a major amount to us at the same time to get us started.
Well, I'm a big fan of Bob Rennie, and that doesn't surprise me, that story. He was a guest of our show last summer, so...
There's a story he tells, which I always repeat because it's such a compelling story. Bob Rennie, his collection, his own private art collection, is all about social justice. So not many people know this, but that's the way that he collects art and the artists that he chooses from. So when we approached him and asked if he would sell the building, at first he didn't want to. He poured his love and heart into renovating this building. But then he thought about it, and then he thought, well, if the Chinese Canadian Museum is opening in Chinatown and I'm still here, how would I feel if I see them move into a lesser building? Because this is the best building in Chinatown. So with that in his mind, he decided he had to sell to us.
Okay, that's a good story. Yeah. What inspired you to become CEO of the museum?
So this job is a job that you don't say no to. As you know, I was born in Vancouver. I am Chinese Canadian, many generations. On one side of the family, we've been here about 3-4 generations. My parents were part of the Hong Kong, Vancouver migration wave of 1967. But myself as a Chinese Canadian, to be a part of opening the first Chinese Canadian museum in the country, to lead and to put work towards that is something you don't say no to.
If I were to walk through the front doors of the museum today and spend, say, an hour and a half at your museum, what's something that I would learn or experience that I would maybe be surprised by that I otherwise wouldn't really maybe expect?
So first of all, an hour and a half is kind of not enough.
Okay.
We have 3 different exhibitions. We have a beautiful rooftop patio. We have so many different things that you can see and experience in the museum. There's everything from an entire period rooms floor dedicated to the Yip family, where you're really immersed in the way they used to live in the 1930s, down to the wallpaper, down to the photo booth, to the historic schoolroom. But we also have galleries with 40-foot high ceilings. And in those galleries, we have our major exhibition, The Paper Trail. We are really learning about Canada's forgotten history of the Chinese people. And then we have our intro gallery where you learn about Chinese Canadian migration. We have a little gift shop. We have lots of tours. And we have lots of friendly museum assistants to guide you around on the way.
Okay, well, that's good. So definitely make sure I plan more than an hour and a half.
Yeah, I would, really suggest doing it in the morning and then going out across the street to Dynasty Seafood, a restaurant for dim sum, or Newtown Bakery. I always tell people to plan it so that they can spend a couple hours at the museum and then have a meal right after.
I like that. That's a good proposition. In the process of being involved in the launch of the museum, can you share any inspiring stories that kind of connected with you personally?
I think that happens every day. I think it happens every time we have these visitors that travel across the country to come and see our exhibitions. We get a lot of mail, both email and paper snail mail, to talk about how much this museum really means to them. For a lot of families across Canada, a lot of Chinese Canadian families, they never thought that their objects or their precious items were worth keeping or worth putting in a museum. And for us to be here and for us to, be interested and put these artifacts on display really changes the narrative of what's precious in Canada's history.
Wow, that's interesting. So with these families coming to your museum, I'm assuming some of them maybe with something to contribute. Do you see maybe over the next 5 years or 10 years, the museum's sort of, library expanding?
Yeah, I think, it's difficult to say because for us, we're a new museum. There's actually not a lot of new museums that open. There's a lot of museums out there and they add to their collection. They have new shows, but brand new museums that open are more rare.
Yeah.
And for us, a lot of what I'm thinking about is how do you open a museum in the 21st century? A lot of museums are doing deaccession, meaning that they are giving away or getting rid or repatriating their objects that, they don't have storage space, or the way that it was originally given to them were stolen goods and they didn't know from different countries. So these were the museums of the 19th century. So us as a museum of the 21st century, how do we think in a new way about collecting and telling people's stories and histories? So I'm kind of thinking through all of that as I think about how we build towards the future.
The BC and federal governments have provided, from what I understand, is roughly about $55 million towards your museum. Can you maybe expand on that a little further? So
it was a process to get us started. It in many ways began with the apology from the provincial government for the wrongs done to the Chinese Canadian community. And then it moved into an MOU between the province and the city. And during Horgan's government, Horgan made a commitment to build a Chinese Canadian museum. And what the NDP government did at first was give us $1 million or so to get us started. And at that time, what the community did was create a working group. And that working group did much discussion and also canvassing across the province with many different community groups. Wherever you go, whatever little city or province, there's a Chinese restaurant, right? Like that's how Chinese immigrants got started. They opened the Chinese restaurant. So all those restaurants have Chinese Canadian communities, right? Like many generations. So it was really reaching out, canvassing communities from all across the province and trying to see what did they want? What does everybody want? So it was a lot of work. That's how the Chinese Canadian Museum started. It was a community museum for everyone. And then last year, the province gave us an additional $30 million, and we used a lot of that to buy the building, the Wing Sang building on 51 East Pender Street from Bob. And then we put $8 million in an endowment. So another thing that a lot of people don't know about museums is they rarely make a profit only from revenue, although maybe you do know that because you're nodding. It's not necessarily, you're supposed to make revenue, but usually your revenue only covers 1/3 of your overall costs. So all sustainable museums usually have an endowment. So that was really important for us also to begin on the right foot and to begin with an endowment as well as owning our own building. So that was the kind of key milestone. And then this year in March, the province gave us an additional $10 million for operating and to continue with our renovations. Federal government came in also at over $5 million, and the city of Vancouver came in as well with some extraordinary funding as well as a construction grant.
Oh, wow. And what did the city of Vancouver do?
They came in at a little over $500,000. Yeah, which is a lot for the city.
For sure it would be. Yeah. Okay, well, that's good. When we do a lot of our work at Coastal Front, we often like to, understand about financial accountability.
Sure.
What steps have you taken to ensure that, this is a largely, taxpayer dollars effectively that have helped fund this. What steps have you taken to ensure that this is being managed properly?
Yeah, we're very conscientious that it is taxpayer money. The majority of our board have a background in finance and in accounting. So I'm very lucky in that way that we have strong financial management skills on our board.
Yeah.
We are very conservative with our investments. It's also mandated by the government, the conservative nature of the way that we invest. And I think like any museum that is thinking ahead, we look to build our endowment and live off the interest.
Yeah.
That is, I think, the eventual goal. We have visitor number goals. Every year, our marketing director has a formula as to how many visitors he hopes to bring in, which will be related to how much marketing spend he's allowed to have.
Yeah.
So these things are really important. Like any museum as well, we're going to depend a lot on rental venue as well as gift shop venue. So these are other revenue avenues that we are exploring. Okay,
good. Well, this sounds like it's been well thought out. Melissa, I want to spend quite a bit of the time now talking about some of the historic, I will describe them as a sort of discriminatory policies that Chinese immigrants and Chinese Canadians have faced in this city, in this province, in this country. So we're going to go through them, and I'm assuming that a lot of this is going to be something that you can actually see at the museum. So, but obviously with your history, I'd like to get your comments. And we're going to kind of go to in a bit of a chronological order. As I said earlier, before in our call yesterday, before we did the filming today, growing up here in British Columbia, I'm 49 years old. you didn't really learn much about the Chinese immigration or contribution to our society, other than the fact that they helped build the railway. And I think you kind of resonated with that, being a product of the BC school education system yourself. And so using ChatGPT, I kind of educated myself, and there's actually quite a deep history. So we're going to go through those. Let's start with the very earliest one, which was the railway. The Canadian Pacific Railway construction, really leaned heavily on Chinese workers, and they faced very dangerous tasks, and actually it's well known that today that they received a lower wage than other workers. But yet their sacrifices, they had a pivotal role in uniting this country. So maybe to start, can you talk a bit about what, someone coming into the museum might learn more about the contribution that Chinese immigrants and Chinese Canadians made to building our national railway?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, you're right, Andrew. I also, going through the Vancouver school system here, really didn't learn about Chinese Canadian history beyond very vague mentions about the railroad and the head tax. For us at the Chinese Canadian Museum, it's really about correcting that impression and really supplementing parts of history that perhaps were not taught in school. Chinese Canadians, they came over because of the railway, but they also came over, the first documented history of Chinese Canadians in Canada actually is 1788. And the Chinese first came over as carpenters. And they came and they actually interacted with the Indigenous people. So even that part of history,
1788?
1788, yeah, Uquat. Mm-hmm.
And they came from across the Pacific?
They came on British boats. Yeah. And so not many people know this. I, just through the research that we did on our ground floor exhibition, which is an introduction to Chinese Canadian migration, we really feature that. So everyone always thinks our story begins with the railway.
With the railway. Like myself. Even ChatGPT didn't give me anything before that.
Well, maybe after this interview, ChatGPT will update.
Yeah, maybe, exactly. Yeah.
So we actually begin in 1788. That's how we begin the exhibition. And then next we go on to the gold rush and the railway.
So let's talk about that. The 1788, there's people from China. They're carpenters. They're from what we've known today as mainland China, or Hong Kong. And
During that time, most Chinese immigrants at that time came from 4 different counties in southern China, which is what we now know as Guangzhou. And they were different villages and counties. And those immigrants came all along the West Coast. So same families from Vancouver to San Francisco, same villages.
And I know this is probably a very ignorant question, but did they come on their own choosing? They weren't brought as slaves. They were brought on their own accord, or?
Yeah, they were carpenters.
Okay.
Yeah. So, so we begin with that history. And then we talk about the gold rush, because that's a major part of our history. And we talk about how a lot of that was really to kind of find a better life. And even Yip Sang, the man that our building is named after, who was a 19-year-old orphan. He came over from China really to seek gold. But when he came here, he realized, being a really smart businessman, that he could make more money not panning for gold, but living off all the infrastructure that surrounded the gold rush. So that's how he made his fortune.
Selling the pans and all the equipment.
And he became a CPR agent. So he helped CP Railway bring over Chinese workers.
Well, because that railway is such a big part of most of our education, maybe can we expand on that a little bit more, though? Can you talk a bit about, for example, this lower wages? What maybe speak to that sort of injustice that happened at the time that we don't really know much about?
Yeah, I think that at the time there was a lot of racism against Chinese people, and even our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, said that the railway would not be built if not for Chinese workers. So there was no other option. either we would use Chinese workers or the railway wouldn't be built. But the way that it was a kind of compromise was that Chinese workers would be paid less. And at the same time, there was the head tax, right? So the head tax was at first $50, which only Chinese people, those of Chinese descent, had to pay the head tax. So it was $50, and then it was $100, and then it went up to $500.
And just to be clear, when we say head tax, this is like an immigration tax. Like,
yes.
You want to come to Canada and live here and work here, you got to pay $50?
Yes, if you are Chinese.
If you're Chinese.
Only if you are Chinese do you need to pay this tax.
Okay. So if you're coming from the States or from Mexico or from Europe, you didn't have to pay it.
You didn't have
to
pay
it. And $50, but we're talking, this was introduced in 1885.
Yes. So the amount of money that was collected altogether was 23 million Canadian dollars. In today's dollars, it's about $1 billion.
Wow.
And just to give you some context, the CPR, the Canadian Pacific Railway, cost $23 million to build. So in essence, the Chinese not only physically built it, they paid for it.
They paid for it. That's amazing. So if I'm a young Chinese male wanting a better life for myself or potentially my family, and I'm coming from China, I mean, I probably don't have $50 on me when I show up on the shores of Vancouver. So was it something that you had to kind of, it was a debt you had to pay off? Is that the idea?
I think for a lot of men, it was a debt. It was borrowing. It was also families that would pool all their wealth together to pay to have one man come over.
Really?
And so it was a family pooling to pay the tax. And then you'd have this one man come over and hopefully find gold and then be able to bring the rest of his family over. But, you know, in the end, that man couldn't, because then the 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted. And so after the head tax was the Exclusion Act. And because of that, a lot of families were separated for 24 years.
Wow. Well, we're going to go to the Exclusion Act in a moment. There's another event that happened in between that, which was the 1907 riots here in Vancouver. Can you talk a little bit about what these riots were, what caused them, and who was involved?
I mean, I think it just speaks to really the anti-Asian sentiment at that time and what really led to the Exclusion Act. I think that major riot is really an example of the feeling at the time among Vancouver's population and community, how there was a sense that, you know, Asians were taking away jobs from white settlers. And there was a real kind of resistance towards any kind of integration of multiculturalism, and it erupted in that way.
So it was riots of European Canadians against Asians? Is
Yes.
that what it was? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And in your museum, do you have any kind of artifacts or pieces about this that kind of you can learn more about?
So the best way to learn about the 1907 anti-Asian riots is actually, I'm going to point to a professor, Henry Sang. He is a professor at Emily Carr, and he just wrote a book which is called the 1907 anti-Asian riots, which we actually sell in our store. And I don't know if it's relevant, but there's actually a panel on September 20th that is all about the book and the 1907 anti-Asian riots, and I'm moderating the panel.
Oh, great.
And Henry and two
at your museum or
at SFU.
At SFU,
yeah,
okay.
and Henry and two other professors will be also talking about the history and the context of the riots.
How did after those riots happened? But before the Exclusion Act, because that's a solid, roughly about 15 years before that happened, how did the local Chinese community kind of recover from those riots and respond?
I mean, I think, it's a difficult time because there was so much overt racism. I think that Chinatown really came into being because Chinese were grouped to live in that area.
I see.
Traditionally, Chinatowns are always in the most impoverished, poorest areas of any city because other settlers don't want to live there. And so there's always that kind of tension, which there is now, even today,
Right.
between like the most impoverished and the heart of historic Chinatown.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. Well, we're going to go into that near the end of our conversation too. Let's talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was implemented in 1923 and it lasted till 1947. So can you start off by maybe explaining to the average person who probably doesn't know much about it, what the Exclusion Act was?
Well, first of all, the first thing I thought of when I learned about the Exclusion Act is it ended in 1947. So to me, that was not very long ago. When you think of these things
No.
where Chinese were excluded or racial discrimination laws, you think that it happened a really long time ago, like the head tax, which was in the 1900s. But Chinese were only excluded in 47, which was the 20th century. It was only repealed at that time.
Yeah.
So to me, that is really astonishing already that history is so close to us in the present.
Yeah.
It happened because, for many reasons, it happened because the Canadian government had raised the head tax to $500, and they felt that that was not enough to dissuade Chinese immigration. The other reason is that the railway was finished, so there was not that kind of urgent necessity. And also, I think politically, there were politics that had changed at that time, the political climate. So, as I said, a lot of families were separated at that time where the men had already come over to Canada and had meant to bring his wife and children, but could not for 24 years. During those 24 years, only 8 Chinese were allowed to come over.
Really?
Yes, it's documented. And actually, I just interviewed the descendant of a veteran, a Chinese-Canadian soldier, and his mother, an Australian-Chinese woman, was one of the 8 to come over. And she was only able to come over because she was a veteran's wife, and they made a special exception, but they actually had to pass her entrance in Parliament, that one person. And I think through this, they realized how ridiculous it was, these exclusion policies. So families were separated, but there was also a whole generation of men that were unable to get married. They lived here in Canada. There was no interracial marriage. And so many of them...
And there were disproportionately, I guess, more men than women.
Yes.
Living here.
It was majority men that came over because that idea was that the men would work first. Right. So there was a whole generation of men, which we call, and we talk about the exhibition, we call them the Bachelors of Chinatown, because they grew old. They lived in Chinatown. They were never able to have their own families. And so children were really precious in this community, in our community. And we did a whole documentary about how the children, who are now in their 60s, they remember their parents telling them they had to go and, just say hello to uncle, say hello to grandfather. And they didn't understand why they had to be nice or, with these old men. But they realized the parents wanted a way to give their children, to have an extended family for these men that were never allowed to have their own children. Wow. And so there were these kind of ad hoc ways to create families in Chinatown because of the Exclusion Act.
Wow, that's interesting. That's very touching. Yeah, it's amazing. Do you see how that's maybe changed the culture of Chinese Canadians in Vancouver specifically? I mean, obviously the act applied to all of Canada. It was a federal law.
It was.
Yeah. But I mean, most of these immigrants were coming from China directly to here, not to Calgary or Toronto per se.
Yeah, majority came to BC. I think if you look also in our exhibition, we have a map of how many Chinese Canadians there were in each province at that time.
Oh, really?
Majority is BC.
Yeah.
But there were some all around the province, including Newfoundland. So in 1923, Newfoundland wasn't a part of Canada, but they enacted their own Chinese Exclusion Act, which is why their exclusion certificates look different from the rest of the country.
Right.
And so we actually feature that in the exhibition. And the curator interviewed the Newfoundland Chinese family and really told their story in the exhibition.
Yeah. It's quite fascinating as I start to kind of think of the math of like 1778, I think is when you said the first Chinese came to Canada. Obviously, in the last 20 years, we've had this huge influx of Chinese immigrants coming into Canada and especially into Metro Vancouver. And to think of this weird period of 24 years and only 8 people showed up.
Yeah.
That was a huge void.
It's a huge void. And, there's so many repercussions of that. There is, of course, that past repercussion of the bachelors and of families being separated. But as I was saying, so the mayor and his family came to visit us just last week, and I was saying to one of his children that part of the reason why it's taken us so long to have our first Chinese Canadian mayor is because of laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act. A lot of people say, wow, there's, a huge Asian population in Vancouver. Why is there only the first Chinese Canadian mayor now?
Yeah.
And part of it is because of laws like the Exclusion Act, where, immigrants of many different nationalities, they don't have the tools or vehicles to move up higher in power, in seniority, in wealth, because of laws like the Exclusion Act.
Wow. It's really powerful. And we can learn about this if we go to the museum.
Yes, you can learn about this.
The last thing I want to talk about as far as, the sort of deep history of Chinese immigrants, and in this case, be more Chinese Canadians, is around what you talked about as World War II, which I think also led to the end of probably helped end the Exclusion Act. I mean, like many Indigenous veterans, there's a number of Chinese Canadian veterans that people don't necessarily know about. And during World War II, I mean, these people were as loyal as everyone else. They were beside fighting, fascists in Germany, and France. So can you talk a bit about like how did Chinese Canadians, how did they serve in the war, and how were they treated when they come back? Was it different for them than other veterans?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Chinese Canadians, they weren't necessarily allowed to fight in World War II, but they would enlist anyways. And they volunteered, even though they weren't the preferred soldier, right? So there was no law saying, Chinese Canadians specifically can't fight, but it would be a kind of selection process, right? But there was a very special troop that were all Chinese Canadians that we talk about in our exhibition. There was a special force, 136, and they were specifically chosen to fight and to basically parachute behind enemy lines into Japan. So these Chinese Canadian soldiers, they had to pretend to be Japanese and really kind of infiltrate. And it was an elite force because they had to learn things like munitions. They had to learn, how to integrate into Japanese culture. So it was really handpicked. And we interviewed one of the veterans' sons, and he talked about his dad, how he really had to go through a training that was really almost similar to James Bond, right? Because he was a spy behind enemy lines. So it's an incredible story, this troop.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, there's my own ignorance. I assumed that these people had gone to Europe, but actually, right, of course, we had a, war in Japan as well.
Yeah, that was a key point for us as well. I think also to say that, part of the reason why Chinese Canadians really insisted that they wanted to fight in the war was, one, because of patriotism, but also because they knew that if they showed their patriotism in that way, that it would help get the right to vote for Chinese Canadians everywhere. And it was something that happened after World War II was over. Chinese Canadians received the right to vote, and a large part of that was because of enlisting in the war.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that they can today. And was the voting ability to vote or not vote, was it tied to the Exclusion Act, or was it they were separate events?
They were separate events. Yeah.
So when was the last time in Canada or in BC a Chinese Canadian not allowed to vote?
I think that they were only allowed to vote after the World War II. So I think not sure when
45
women
or 40, yeah.
Women were allowed. We should
women.
ask ChatGPT.
Yeah, we should. Well, is there any other? We've covered quite a few topics, and I do want to get into talk about safety. You mentioned earlier about how most Chinatowns around the world you will find in the most sort of impoverished neighborhoods in cities. So I do want to talk about neighborhood safety because obviously our Chinatown here in Vancouver is right on the edge of the downtown east side, which has had some real challenges in the last 20, 30, well, probably longer, 50 years, but especially in the last decade. But before we go into that, just is there anything else that I haven't kind of touched on that'd be worthwhile noting that, again, going back to that original question, if I walked into your museum, and I'm not going to be there for an hour and a half, we'll spend 2 hours there, 2.5, and then I'll go for my amazing lunch. But is there anything else that I would be excited to see or inspired by or surprised by going into your museum today that we haven't kind of covered?
I think it's important to also go up to the third floor and see our historic schoolroom because it actually is arguably the oldest schoolroom in Vancouver. It was founded in 1914. It was established in 1901. And back then, schools were just simply a room. So one room, which would be the schoolroom, would be that entire school. And so Yip sang, he had 23 children, and a lot of the children learned there, but also children around the neighborhood.
He had 23 of his own children, or he was a teacher of 23?
No. He had 3 wives. He actually had 4 wives. One wife was in China, but 3 wives lived there with him. And it was all, amenable, as we know, because I think the second wife helped pick the third wife. First wife helped pick the second wife. 23 children. At one point, some of the descendants, which we interviewed in a documentary, Mel Yip said that at one point when he was living there were 80 Yips in the building, and they had 2 bathrooms and 1 kitchen.
Wow. And this schoolroom that's on your third floor, is it actually where the schoolroom was?
It is.
Okay, so it's not like you just, kind of created a sort of an idea of what it would have been. It's actually the location where the schoolroom was?
It's the actual schoolroom.
Really?
So Bob actually didn't really have it open to the public this whole time. And when he took over the building was dilapidated. It was a complete mess, and he had to renovate everything. But miraculously, that one schoolroom was intact and remained intact from that time to the chalkboard writing that was on the wall. On the chalkboard. So he preserved it all these years, and he framed the chalkboard so that it would be preserved forever. But it was, used as their boardroom. It wasn't open to the public. So we've opened it to the public for the first time. And you can go in there and see how it has been preserved all these years.
Wow.
So it's actually
That's
very
pretty special. Yeah, for sure. Okay, Melissa, this has been great. Let's change this conversation to the physical location where your museum exists today. It's in Chinatown in Vancouver on the edge of the downtown east side, which has had a lot of challenges. Now, we know that there's been a 7% increase in violent crime reported since basically from pre-COVID period in general, but we also know there's even a larger rise specifically in sort of Asian hate crime. Can you maybe talk for a moment about any noticeable improvements that have happened in Chinatown since Ken Sim, a former guest on Coastal Front, has become mayor? I'm assuming he's had some hopefully positive impact.
Sure. I think that it has been positive since Ken has been elected. He's made it a real cornerstone of his campaign promise, which he is delivering on, to really focus on Chinatown revitalization. it has been dangerous, and it is also distressing to see the drug use and also to see the poverty around the streets of Vancouver and on East Hastings. But I have to say that for us in Chinatown, we do feel more safe now that the encampments are gone and the tents. It's made a big difference in foot traffic. And how people come down and see us. I think that, the mayor opening up an office in Chinatown is a real commitment to the neighborhood. He opened it up during the summer. The office is
Just to be clear, this is the mayor's office? He's got like a satellite office, so to speak? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's a satellite office, and it's in the building that the city owns. I think it's called Chinatown Plaza, where Floda restaurant is.
Okay.
It's just right on the ground floor, and it's called the Alexander Gumyao office. The reason why it's named after him is because Alexander Gumyao was the first born Chinese Canadian in Canada.
Really?
Yes, and his certificate is also in the exhibition.
What year was he born? Remember?
No, we need to ask ChatGPT.
Maybe you can look that one up, Kieran.
Yeah.
Wow. So he's opened up this office. Obviously, yeah, he took down that tent encampment. I think it was last summer, if I recall. And so you're starting. I mean, would you describe Chinatown as a family-friendly area today?
Yeah.
Because I know you talked to me yesterday about your experience of Chinatown as a child yourself, and your mom would drop you off. And
yeah,
maybe you should tell that story. It's a neat story.
Sure. Chinatown of the 80s and 90s is the Chinatown that I remember growing up here. My grandmother went to church on Sunday at the Chinatown church, and my mom and I would go for dinner with her at the local diner, Goldstone Diner. We'd go pick up bakery goods, and I give this example as a reason of how safe my family felt. I'd be 7 years old and my mom couldn't find parking because it was so busy. And so she would just drop me off in front of the bakery, and I'd run out as a 7-year-old kid, go and buy bakery goods and wait on the street until
with cash.
Yes, with cash.
And you probably had to count the change afterwards to make sure you showed your mom that you got the right change back.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, though actually those bakeries still only take cash, just so you know.
Okay.
There's still no credit card at those bakeries. But she'd drive around the block, and she completely felt safe that a 7-year-old would stand on the street, on the sidewalk, and wait for her to run around. For myself, my own 7-year-old, I don't think that I would do that because the streets are a little scary still. But as I said, there has been huge waves ahead, and there has been huge advances since lots of the people in the community are banding together to make Chinatown back the way it was, the way it was in the 80s and 90s. Ken is doing a lot, and other neighbors, Carol Lee, is doing a lot for the neighborhood.
We're having her on next week.
Yeah, she's really tireless in making Chinatown a great place to visit. All the festivals that we have, one that she's organized this weekend, Light Up Chinatown, I think has really done a lot in trying to revitalize the neighborhood.
Yeah, well, that's good. It's nice to hear it's turning a page.
I think for us too, we hope that we can be a cultural anchor to bring people back to Chinatown, and so that is something that we hope people will feel more comfortable doing.
That's great. I want to take a few minutes for us to let the listeners and viewers know about how they can get involved. I'm assuming to start, the museum is a charity. And as you mentioned, most charities, run a deficit. They're not fully just off their, whether they have an endowment or through their, they need donations. So maybe you can talk a little about that and how people can contribute. But also let's talk about your location, your hours. And I love your idea of going and visiting and then having a lunch at one of these restaurants nearby.
Yeah, I mean, it's really some of the best food in the city is in Chinatown.
Yeah.
We have everything from a Michelin star restaurant, Kissa Tanto, to to really great bakeries that have been around since I was a kid. Newtown Bakery, to dim sum, Jade Dynasty. This is not a food podcast though, right?
No, yeah.
We can kind of that's another podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's many ways to contribute. And I have to say that we've been really lucky with our community. We've had a lot of large donations. We have the Poi family, Vivian Poi, the first Asian Canadian senator. Her family has donated $2.8 million to the museum. We had Doreen and Philip Lau. Doreen is the daughter of David Lam, the first lieutenant governor, Chinese Canadian in BC. Their family donated $1 million. And even my own board chair, Grace Wong, she and her husband have donated over $1 million for the museum. So those are the larger donations, but we've had smaller donations too. And each donation really is part of the support that we're so grateful to receive from the community, that we hope people will continue to support us.
Yeah, that's nice. What about the actual location and hours, and what is the cost if I wanted to take my 3 kids and my wife to your museum?
Well, you know what? So we're at 51 East Pender Street, and it's pretty cheap to go. Adults are $15, seniors are $12, and students are $10. But we actually just launched a family discount. Okay. So you, your wife, and your 3 children could totally go in for even cheaper than that.
Yeah.
Even the mayor, he came in and he did what a lot of people do. After he finished the tour and the exhibition, he bought a season pass. Okay. So that's the best deal of all. If you buy an annual pass, you actually get a free ticket, so you can bring in a friend. It's cheaper than actually just buying the admission ticket.
Yeah, great. I imagine that probably the parking in the area will cost me more than the museum itself.
Well, you know what? It used to be that way, but we've actually the city has actually just lowered parking in Chinatown.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay,
that was
smart
was a specific ask that we in the neighborhood wanted.
Yeah.
To bring people back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Melissa Karmen Lee, CEO of the Chinese Canadian Museum in our Chinatown here in our own Vancouver. Thanks for all the great work you're doing. And I look forward to taking my family down and going and visiting and learning more about what we've just talked about today. So thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, Andrew. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today.